Hey everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Lessons from Terrible Students. My name is Jeremy, and I, along with my co-host Tara, will be guiding you through the world of training and development. Today, we're going to introduce ourselves, give you an idea of who we are and what this podcast is all about. But before we do any of that, I wanted to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by Lumius. At Lumius, we create learning programs based on how people learn without draining your team's resources along the way. Lumius is your partner in learning. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the episode. So at this point, I guess we should explain to you guys why we decided to call the podcast Lessons from Terrible Students. Essentially, we are terrible students. I always have been. Tara apparently always has been as well. We've had many discussions about this. I wanted to kind of explain that and why we decided to call the podcast Lessons from Terrible Students. This is not to say that we're failing classes, that we're not paying attention, anything like that. Essentially, it's the exact opposite of that. Once I got into this field, I started looking at training in a different manner. Now I see more than just the content. So if the content is not engaging, if I'm not into that content, what I start to do is, I don't want to say judge, that's probably a little too harsh. I start to evaluate the course itself as far as flow, as far as, is this how I would have done it? Is this kind of the way that I would have put this course together? I don't analyze facilitation as much because that is not where I shine. And I probably feel like I'm worse at it than most other people. So I just always assume they're doing a great job. But I am evaluating course content and activities, timing, all that kind of stuff. I believe that's what makes me a terrible student. Tara, is that kind of where you're at? Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
100%. A student, always. However, as a student, you're right. Whenever you're a kid or whenever you're in college or even when you go to training courses, before you get into the training realm, you are thinking about the behind the scenes, what happened to get here. Now we know how the sausage is made. So we're naturally always wondering, I wonder how they made that sausage. I mean, seriously, it's like, what made them think that that was a good idea? And it does feel judgy, but it's not, but there are theories. There's learning theories behind why we do that. And we'll talk about this later.
There's always learning theories for, let's at least we got that particular introduction out of the way. For Tara, there's always a learning theory. That's I feel like that will be your catchphrase by like episode 3. Is there's a learning theory for that? Yeah,
it is true.
So I mean, when I was, and we'll get into kind of our work history in a little bit, but when I was in the field and it was my quote unquote turn to take a training course. For me, I was never thinking, what they do to put this together. I honestly didn't even know that instructional designers were a thing. Like I thought all of this was made by the guy that was teaching me the class. Like I never thought there was like a whole team behind him developing these materials. So for me, it was always, hey, this is a day I don't have to climb a pole or crawl under a house. Like I never thought about it past that until I got into the training field and got interested in this, and realized there's all this kind of stuff behind it and all these learning theories that are used to, why we present things this way. And that's kind of where my career, I feel like, started. Like I had a job as a technician, but my career started when I got into that learning space. But I don't want to go too deep into that because we are going to do that here in a little bit. What I want to do first is go over kind of our goals in putting this podcast together. We want to, at least for this first season, what we want to do is discuss the relationships within training, how we all work together, who is there, who does what. So we've got our PMs, we've got our SMEs, we got our stakeholders, we got IDs, we got more people other than that if we need them. There's maybe third parties that we're working with. We're working with all kind of different people with different skill sets. One thing that I've learned over my relatively shorter career is that a lot of times communication breaks down between these folks, just because we don't quite understand what everybody does. So that's kind of what we want to tackle in this first season. Our first season, hopefully we'll have more than one, but this one is what we're calling our SME to ID season. I think most instructional designers were at some kind of SME at some point in their career. I started as one. Again, I had no intention of becoming an instructional designer. I think that's another thing that a lot of instructional designers have in common is none of us went to college saying I'm going to be an instructional designer, or I guess I should say most of us didn't. But so that's kind of our goal, is to identify who all of these roles are, for both sides, describe what those people do. I think there's a misconception on both sides of the spectrum on what SMEs are doing, what stakeholders are doing, IDs, all those kind of people. We're also going to explain some of the learning theories we use. Primarily the doctor, Tara, is going to explain all of those learning theories. I have a working knowledge. She is much more knowledgeable in that fact than I am, so we're definitely going to let her take a lot of the discussion on that. And then finally, what we're going to do, or what we hope to do, is provide real and concrete things that you can walk away from. Most of our episodes will have some kind of walk-away document, whether that's a QRG or some other kind of document that you can use relating to what we discussed on the podcast itself. So that's kind of our overall goal for this entire season. Our goal for this specific episode, however, is to introduce the two of us and then kind of go into a high level discussion on, or the three of us now, kind of go into a high level discussion on what an ID does on a day-to-day basis. So that's kind of our goal for this episode. So with that, I'm just going to keep talking because I'm going to go first. So again, my name is Jeremy Brown. I have a bachelor's degree in computer information systems, which obviously has nothing to do with instructional design. But what are you going to do? When I came out of college in 2007, I found out that nobody's wanting to hire anybody. So I had two starting options. I could be what we call a lateral entry teacher in North Carolina, which is where I live. So essentially I could go back and teach keyboarding to high school kids, or I had a job offer from a local ISP that I won't mention the name of, even though they're not around anymore, but to install cable. So to drive to people's houses, install cable, troubleshoot when they're having internet, TV problems, all that kind of fun stuff. Sadly, installing cable paid more than being a teacher, so that's where I went. I was a service technician, installation technician for 7 years. Went through various different teams, various different products that we supported, from phone, internet, television, digital cable, switch digital, security, all that kind of fun stuff. Was on a couple of different teams while I was in that tenure. Eventually, I came across a job listing for something called a training content specialist. So this was essentially the go-between between the field work and the corporate learning team. And again, this was a communication post, because it did seem like a lot of times there was a miscommunication between, the people sitting in the corporate office writing this material and the actual material they were putting out. So my job was to kind of talk to both teams and figure out that happy medium. So that was kind of a great role to get started in L&D. And that's kind of the mentality I've brought to my career this far, is to always remember that there are these guys. This is not their primary job to help us to create learning. Like, their primary job is to still go out and customer service or communications or whatever we're developing, when we're talking to people, that's not their primary job. Their primary job is not to help us create learning. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes in, is I do think sometimes as IDs we forget that, because this is our primary job and this is kind of what we do, and we just assume that they should be available when they're available. So after being in that role for about a year and a half, 2 years, I applied for an instructional designer position. I got that position, and that's what I've been doing ever since, probably since about 2017, if I'm remembering correctly. I am getting old, so I don't quite remember exactly the years, but that's what we're going to say. Once I was promoted to an ID, I kind of saw more of the background of what IDs do and what they're kind of expected to learn. I have not gone back and got any kind of higher education degree in instructional design. I've kind of learned by doing, taking a lot of different training courses and e-learning courses and in-person courses, certifications, all that kind of fun stuff to advance my career. But I've not gone back and gotten a traditional school degree. That's not really where my interest lies. I prefer to stay on kind of the technology side of it and kind of pick up the rest as we go. That's why I lean heavily on people like Tara. I affectionately call her the doctor. She is kind of my go-to when I have questions, and she hates when I call her the doctor. So I will turn it over to her now. Tara, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Tara Roberson-Moore, and I have been an instructional designer for a long time, a lot longer than I have been a doctor. And unlike Jeremy, I'm not going to talk about what years I did anything, because I'm not willing to go there. And like Jeremy, I also am basically an accidental instructional designer. I don't know if any of you have read that book, and I'm going to blank on the author right this second, but I definitely recommend it to anybody who is breaking into this field, especially if you're coming from the subject matter expert or SME side of it. Be sure to take a look at that book.
That was the first book that I was given. Like, they gave me that book when I started as an instructional designer, because I was working with the same team. And they knew where I was coming from. They're like, here, you need to read this. Okay.
Yep, absolutely. I am a self-professed dork. So for me, it's very important when I do things that I know why I'm doing them. A lot of what we do in instructional design is common sense. It's just the way that you kind of naturally start doing things. And I think, Jeremy, you might agree with me on that you just kind of start doing stuff. But like Jeremy said, there's usually a learning theory behind it that you can use to support the reason why you do it. And while he laughs or rolls his eyes at my theories, the good thing about it is if you know a little bit about them, you can wow your SMEs that you're working with on the team, and you can explain to them why you do it that way. Because the one thing to remember, I think that's super important, is that you're going into a project, your subject matter experts know what they're doing. They know their job, they know their processes, they know their systems. You know learning. So you are an SME on the project too. You're just coming at it from a different angle. So without being an arrogant jerk or anything like that, you can just explain, this is why we do an activity this way. And you can explain why it's, better for the learner, why they can transfer the information better back to the job and that sort of thing. Now, you won't always win all of those discussions, and sometimes there is a win or a lose to it. But the idea is to be able to back up what you're doing and what you're recommending to them. So that is my sermon for this episode when it comes to that sort of thing. Not unlike Jeremy, I started out as a journalist. So before you switch this off and run away, I left journalism about the time it started to lose its mind. So I left to work on the other side. So you weren't in the
24-hour news cycle? Is that what you're telling me?
No, I was not a fan. Well, it was more about, and this is a whole different pod actually, but I don't think journalists should have an opinion. I was trained in the classic form of journalism where you are an unbiased observer, you present the information and the reader decides. That is
That's crazy
journalism.
talk. That's crazy.
Exactly.
Talk now.
I know. So I got out as that started to happen. But my job before was I was the news editor, but I was also the cops and crimes reporter. So I worked a lot with the police, and I also worked with crime victims. And I worked with the district attorney, and he offered me a job in his office. And so I went to his office, and I decided I actually had started majoring in criminal justice for my graduate degree, my master's. And so I went to work for him, and I worked on the other side of the coin, basically, and worked with victims and witnesses from that side of it. And part of my job was to help them feel more comfortable going to court. Well, one of the best ways, and there's a learning theory for this, to make someone feel more comfortable with things like that is to teach them about it. Make it seem more familiar. Let them come to the courthouse, give tours, talk to them about, what is expected of them on the stand. And I'm not talking about coaching testimony. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just get them comfortable, because most people have no reason to go to the courthouse for anything. So when they're called there, it's usually not a good thing, So it's something that's very traumatic, and they've already been through something traumatic. So I just sort of started teaching people about that. And then I started teaching other victim witness coordinators about what we did in our office. And that grew to a state level job with the agency that oversees district attorneys. And I went and worked for them as a federal grants manager. And in that position, part of my job was to subgrant money to other people in the state. And I had to train them in how to get their money, how to apply for the money, how to use the money. So I just sort of started teaching people how to do stuff. That's really what it came down to. And when I was there at that position, I was thinking I wanted my PhD because I'm a dork, and I have my own personal bucket list. So I decided to go back to grad school again. And somebody said, did you know that have you ever thought about education? And I was like, why on earth would I get a PhD in education? And they were like, well, what you do is specific. So you should do some research on it. You have a natural knack for this. Go do it. So I started looking into things, and sure enough, right here in my hometown where I am, our university had a workforce and adult education program. I had no idea that that sort of thing even existed. And it's basically what I do for a living. And so I was like, yep, I want to do this. This is totally interesting to me. I think it's cool. And so that's why I have a PhD, which you do not need to be an instructional designer. You don't have to have one. You do not have to. And as Jeremy said, thankfully, is that what you said?
Yeah, thankfully for me. That's not, again, terrible student. I just am. Yeah. I get bored easily in a classroom. I don't know. Regardless of content, a lot of times I feel like I pick things up quickly. And then in the repetition that I know from being in this role that needs to be there, I get that now and I understand it. But I'm a terrible student. I don't see myself going back. It's not something that's on my bucket list. So I am very thankful that I understand why people go and get it. I understand what it does for you. And I understand that you do learn a lot while doing that. It's just not the way that I want to learn it. So I'm very appreciative that I don't need that doctorate. Plus my student loans are already stupid. So I don't need it anymore.
Well, and it's not even, like I said, what we do is not necessarily, it's not definitely not rocket science, but we could create curriculum for rocket science because you don't have to be an SME in what you're writing curriculum about in order to write the curriculum. If you give an ID, an instructional designer, enough content information and the right SME, they can write you a lesson on just about anything. So I have seen that in some of my other positions where the expectation that I should be a subject matter expert in something in order to write about it is actually a backwards way of thinking of it, because, and in that particular field, they often do that. They use their SMEs. It's like you said, Jeremy, you walked into a training and you just assume that the guy who's teaching is the one who wrote it. In a lot of places, especially places like the military, police forces, firefighting, some of the more, they consider them militaristic type organizations, the top down hierarchy type thing. That is often the case. They want to be trained by people who've done the job. And I totally get that. But there's a difference between facilitating a class and writing content for a class. Often people who approach it from the SME perspective, the subject matter experts perspective, are thinking of it from their perspective. What do I want or need to teach these people, as opposed to what do these people, the students, need to know in order to be successful at this job? They're thinking of it from, what do I need to teach, as opposed to what do they need to learn? And those two things are different, usually. And there's a theory for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. There he is. So that's our not so quick introductions, I guess. But what I want to do now is let's back up a little bit. What I want to do is let's identify the key players we're talking about, because each one of these has their own acronym. So I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same starting ground. Starting with, of course, the ID. Tara and I are both instructional designers, or IDs. We are the ones that develop, create the materials. We'll go into more detail about that here in a second, because that's what this episode is actually about. So we'll go into more detail there in a second. However, we could not do our jobs without the other people. Primarily, we're going to start with project managers. So our PMs, these are the people that keep everyone on task. They schedule the meetings. They make sure that everybody has everything that they need. I love them so much. In a lot of companies, the ID and the PM are actually the same role. That becomes very hard to deal with once you get, 4, 5, 6 projects on your plate. It's very hard to wear both of those hats a lot of times. So it is a lot more effective, in my experience, to have those roles be two separate people. But a lot of times the ID and the PM, those are going to be the same person. In addition to that, we have
a lot of people. I'm sorry, Jeremy.
No, go ahead.
I want to add to that. I want to add that to that, Jeremy, without interrupting you. So figure out however you want to cut that to fit whatever you want to say.
We're not cutting anything. Keep going. What do you got?
Well, those damn PMs. No, I'm kidding. No, project managers. Most ID projects, instructional design projects, I'm not going to say most. A lot of them don't have project managers, especially if you are an instructional developer or designer who is working independently as a contractor. You may be project managing your own projects. And that's just a whole different dynamic. I call it good cop, bad cop. Because as an ID, you want to build rapport with your SMEs and your subject matter people and the other people we're going to talk about, the stakeholders. You want to build a rapport with them. And it's hard to build that rapport and be the good cop, so to speak. As it is, it's a lot harder to tell people that they're past their due date, or have to be the person who basically, for lack of a better term, nags them about getting stuff done whenever they need to get it done. So that makes that's a different relationship than what an ID usually has with their subject matter experts. So while the project managers, it's awesome to have one who can be that person, so you can have that separation of power. So that is my preference for project managers.
Yeah. Oh, no, I agree 100%. I was never, and admittedly, that was not where I shine, and still isn't, when it comes to the instructional design world. I can do it. I can put together all the Gantt charts and all that kind of stuff. I just don't like doing it. So I don't, it's not something that I enjoy doing. So, obviously a lot of my passion doesn't go that way. So it doesn't get done with the same amount of work and effort as the analysis and design and all that kind of stuff that we'll talk about here in a second. But
Right.
so we've got our IDs, our instructional designers. We've got our PMs, our project managers. Now we're moving kind of over to the other side of the aisle, for lack of a better term. We're going to start with our SMEs. So we say SMEs, that's SME, subject matter expert. So these are the men and women that know the content. So these are the people that have said or have been identified as these are the people you need to talk to. These are the people that know it. These are the people that can tell you what your audience needs, because our end goal is always, what do our learners need to know? As IDs coming in, we don't know our audience. We don't know what they already know. We don't know what they're going to need to know going forward past this course. So these are the people that kind of identify that for us. And they serve a bunch of other functions that we'll probably get to later, but that's their primary role, is to educate us on the topic at hand, the day-to-day work, what they know, what they need to know, all that kind of fun stuff. And those are the big questions when designing learning, is what does my audience already know and what do they need to know? So you can identify that gap, what we call the knowledge gap. So you can figure out how to plug that gap with your course.
Yeah.
Now, how do we figure out who
that? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Knock it out.
Oh, I was just going to say, and in addition to that, it's also performance gaps. If there's something that someone needs, it's what they need to know and what they need to do. Because sometimes, especially in workforce training, we're teaching them how to do a specific task. It's related to work. We're not just giving them some, theory of how they're supposed to do it. We're actually showing them the step-by-step of how to complete a task. Usually workforce training is functional. So there's usually a knowledge and performance that go with that. And SMEs are the people who can tell us how to do the job. Something I think that's important when you're working with these SMEs is they may have been like voluntold to show up at a working meeting with you and have no idea why they're there, what they're there for, what on earth is the purpose of this. They have no idea this class is being redone or being developed. So what we do is at our company is we do have kickoff meetings with our SME group so that so we're all on the same page when we get started, because more often than not, you could have people walking into the room or, your virtual room who have absolutely no idea why they're there. That's never happened to you, a good segue,
Jeremy. Is that? No, never. That's a good segue into our next actor, the stakeholder. So the stakeholder is also on that business side. So they are the one that they've identified the need for the training course. So something in the business has come up. Maybe some problem, maybe there's a new process coming, something like that, but they've identified the fact that they need a training course. These are the stakeholders. These are the people that actually have skin in the game, per se, because they're the ones that have been tapped to fix whatever this problem is, to make sure that this new process happens or this new product comes out without a hitch. And a big part of that is training. So they've identified that they need training, and they have also identified who already knows what we need to train on. So the stakeholders are actually the ones usually that identify what SMEs are best to talk to. Now that can happen prior to talking to the ID. It can happen after talking to the ID and doing a little bit of analysis, teaser for what we're going to get into next. But at some point, the stakeholder has to make that decision of, okay, I want, employee A, B, C, and D. They're going to be your SMEs. These are the ones that I trust know the content enough to A, tell you what you need to write, and B, review what you give them. Because another key role of the SME and the stakeholder is to review the drafts, the prototypes, everything that we make before we consider it final or final, or final, depending on which version we're on. but they are the ones that's got to make sure it's accurate. We can write it all day long, but we cannot review it from a content perspective. That has to be done by the SMEs and the stakeholders, because as Tara mentioned earlier, we are not the experts on these things. We develop a working knowledge as we go through and make these trainings, which is another thing I love about this job, is you will develop a working knowledge of just random stuff, which is really fun for me. But in the end, it comes down to those SMEs and those stakeholders to say, yes, this is what we need. This is what we need to put out. Or I think we missed the mark. Let's go back and figure out what we need to add. And they have to be, and what I've learned is a good SME and a good stakeholder has that ability to say, no, this is not what we need. I would rather you say that early and often enough to where we stop and address that instead of thinking that we know and that we'll change it going along. And we'll get into more of that communication and that relationship in later episodes. But the key for me, for the SMEs and the stakeholders, to be able to say, yes, this is what we want, or actually, no, this is not quite what we need. Let's go back to the drawing board, or let's make some tweaks and figure out how we can get it where we're going to get it. Sorry, anything else on the stakeholder?
Yeah, it's about time and money. If they've come in, especially for us, because we are a third-party vendor. Now, this can be different if you're an internal L&D person doing work for someone within your organization. You probably operate very much the same. You intake projects, you develop it, you work with SMEs, all of that, all of those things. For us, because we are a third-party vendor, it's about time and money. Our customers have come to us and said, we need this in this amount of time. We have this much money we can spend. And so part of our goal is not just to make sure that the content is what they need, but we also have to stay within those parameters usually. And that is a limiting factor sometimes, that your SMEs and stakeholders, nobody wants to talk about, oh, darn, we could make that change, but that's not within our scope of work, so it's going to cost more. No, everybody tiptoes around that. And I understand that from a business perspective. So it's just really important that's why it's so important for those stakeholders who are not SMEs, are decision makers, people who can say, if you have two SMEs who give you two pieces of information that contradict each other and there's no way to get them to find neutral ground, you need somebody who is also an expert from that group or whatever to say, we're going to go with A instead of B, because if not, we're left guessing. And that is a waste of their time and their money if we're trying to guess what is right. So it's like, we need decision makers on the project. And that's why that is my takeaway for stakeholders, is give me somebody who can make a final decision if we can't get a compromise with the group.
Yeah. Well, and in the end, it falls on them, right? Like Tara said, we're kind of a third party. So we're going to develop this to the best of our ability within your budget, within your time frame. But in the end, this is going to reflect on the stakeholders. That's kind of their role. So you're absolutely right. We absolutely do need somebody that can make that decision and take all of the feedback in, and budget and time and all this, and say, this is the best point to move forward. So yeah, I agree. But that's ID, PM, SME, stakeholder. I think that's everybody, right? Am I forgetting anybody? I don't think so.
No, I mean, there could be other people. There could be graphics people and that sort of thing. But, it just depends on the project.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, depending on budget and what the ID is capable of, yeah, we can always have, script writers. We could have video production specialists and all that kind of stuff. That goes more into like the design and development side of the process, which we're going to get to here in just a second. So, but those are our big primary ones, right? Those are the big four.
I think that one of the things, if you're a SME who's been asked, let's look at it from a different perspective. So if you are a SME who's been asked to help develop a course, there are a couple roles you could be in. You could be a SME for a third party, like a vendor or your internal L&D team. You may be the person that's asked to assist them, provide them information, content, check stuff, review things. Or you could be a SME, especially in an internal position that is asked to actually, like Jeremy was, write some content and help produce some deliverables and materials. And that's something that we, as we talk through this in this podcast this season, is we'll be able to hopefully give you some of those basic things that help you get started in that role if you're going to. Or if you work for a company that doesn't have internal L&D, doesn't use vendors, you know, you guys do everything internally and you are just the person who gets stuck writing training all the time. We can give you some basics, some basic information to make that task easier, because if it's not your specialty, it's not your specialty. So we'll train you.
It's hard. No, and that's another thing that I'm going to try to do, because, I mean, to be completely honest, you know, I hit some pitfalls where I'm like, oh man, like I have no idea what I'm doing in this instance. Like I need to go research and read and find, because I've been asked to do something that I have no experience in doing. So hopefully I'm going to fill in some of those same pitfalls and kind of guide anybody else in that journey around it, because that was, I mean, my journey was the example I always give when I started as a training content specialist is my first course that I had to build was a Captivate course. And I didn't even have Captivate on my computer yet. So I had to go, like I learned Captivate by watching videos online and just trying to remember where I need to click, because I couldn't even follow along in the program. So I had like a notebook with all this stuff written down as I'm trying to learn this stuff, because I had never used it before. I had just come from, you know, installing cable 2 weeks ago. I was hanging off the side of a pole 30 feet in the air. So it was a big change in kind of my career direction. So, but it was fun.
Yeah.
Well, I say it's fun now. Probably wasn't that fun for me then. I say it's fun now. But so let's actually get into some of that. So let's talk about what we as instructional designers, as IDs, what kind of the day-to-day kind of, let's start with the big things of what we do. And this is where we introduce our first learning theory, which is it's the biggie, right? It's what I feel like, and Tara may and usually will correct me when I say things like this, but I think Addie is kind of what a lot of these other learning theories branch out of. Like, I feel like I've heard more about Addie than anything else. And I don't know if that's just because it's one of the older ones or what, but Addie, spelled A-D-D-I-E. Let me finish, and then we'll get there. Let me finish. Addie, spelled A-D-D-I-E, stands for analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. So these are kind of the big buckets that contain the different parts of our job. Analysis is where we actually try to figure out where those gaps are. We talked about knowledge gaps and performance gaps earlier. So that's where we're doing an audience analysis, where we're trying to figure out who our audience is, when they work, what their mindset is, how they learn, what they need to know, what they already know, all that kind of stuff. Once we get all of that analysis done, and I'm sure there's much, much more in there. We'll expand these here in a second. But once we get all of that information from the analysis, we move into the design phase. So the design phase is where we start figuring out how we're going to deliver all of this content to the audience and the best way to get it to them, whether that's an e-learning, whether that's an in-person class, whether that's, you know, just a job aid or a quick reference guide, whatever you call them. Whether it's just, sometimes it may not even be a training problem. That's where the analysis comes in as well, is figure out, okay, is this a training problem, or do they know it? They just don't want to do it anymore. Is it a motivation problem? I feel like that's a big question that comes up in analysis is this training or is this motivational issue? But the design is where we try to figure out the best way to teach the class. Once we get the design, I'm not going to say settled. Once we get it semi-settled, we move into development. Development is where we actually start making some of these prototypes, some of the assets, the Word documents, the PowerPoints, the e-learnings, the videos, writing scripts, all that kind of fun stuff. Usually we waffle back and forth between the two Ds. The design and development are a very gray area. So we kind of go back and forth as we're developing. We realize something we designed maybe is not going to work the way we intended, and we're kind of back and forth there. But once we get through all of that, we go to implementation. So implementation is actually starting the class, whether that's, okay, let's have a beta, let's see how it works, let's just soft launch this thing, let's announce it like crazy and launch this thing because we're very confident that it's ready to go. However we want to do that, that's the implementation side. So the implementation side is where the majority of learners are actually going to start taking this course. After that, once the course has kind of lived for a little bit, there's the last stage, which sometimes, unfortunately, is forgotten about, but a lot of times is probably one of the most important. There's the evaluation stage. So you go back after these people have taken it and figure out if we've actually resolved the original need that the course was developed for. So did we fill that knowledge gap? Did we fill that performance gap? Is this course doing what we wanted it to do? And if so, did it create another problem? Did it show us that this wasn't the actual problem to begin with? So that may actually lead us right back to analysis. In my opinion, the analysis honestly never stops. We just do a lot more of it in the beginning. I feel like a good project, you'll have analysis throughout, but that's kind of my 2 cents there. Now, I know that Tara has been biting her lip to jump in 9 different times on these different things. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to her. That is the high level of ADDIE theory, kind of what you do and all that kind of fun stuff. So Doctor, take it away. ADDIE, all yours.
ADDIE is an instructional development model. It is a waterfall model. And regardless of whether you use Agile, rapid prototyping, SAM 2, whatever you want to call it, they all were born from ADDIE, and they all contain the same steps as ADDIE. They just may be sequenced differently. They may be repeated. They may just be used in a different way. But ADDIE is like the granddaddy. Oh, I made a rhyme. That was an accident, but I like it. It was actually historically developed by the military. And before anybody goes crazy, a lot of things in training development get their start in government contracts that eventually move into industry because the government has more money usually to spend on those kinds of things. So that is why it was developed first in the military and used to develop military training. And that's why it is very segmented and you can find lots and lots of things to tell you exactly how to perform waterfall method. The thing about waterfall method is it can take longer. It can be long, it can be short, but usually if you do a full analysis of a project, a full design phase, a full development phase, an implementation is usually like a pilot course, a pilot report, revisions based on that, and then a rollout. There's implementation can be a huge thing. And then, of course, like Jeremy said, the evaluation piece. And you'll often see graphics of ADDIE that has the evaluation actually in the middle, because you really are in a waterfall method looking at everything at every phase and reviewing it to make sure that it is correct moving forward. You are evaluating constantly. So
are you saying you should not go chasing waterfalls? Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And if you didn't learn that the first time, you should learn it this time. Don't go chasing waterfalls, people. That might be the pod name. That could be the pod name, Jeremy. That's all I'm saying. All right. Don't go chasing waterfalls.
That's fun.
So anyway, at our particular company, we kind of combine ADDIE with Agile, and we move very quickly through the different steps. And analysis and evaluation often get skipped, and I'm not going to get on my soapbox about that right now. We'll do that later. But without those, my argument is you do not know whether you have a successful training or not. You can get smile sheets from the people who take it that say, this was awesome, but that means nothing if it doesn't translate to taking it back and being able to do it. There.
Yeah, so a smile sheet for anybody that doesn't know. So that's a quote unquote level 1 evaluation. You give them right after they take the course, and you say, "Hey, did you like this course?" Go ahead.
Wait, level 1 of a theory? Is that? Are you like?
I did.
Are
I
you
just
theory
dropped
talking?
a
Dropped a
Kirkpatrick. Is that
Kirkpatrick.
that's saying
Oh,
it? Yeah. Uh, yeah. So essentially, that's anybody that's taking a corporate training class or probably a training class in general has taken this at the end of their course, where it's, did you like the course? Another question might be, do you think this course covered, the content well or whatever? And you rate it 1 to 10 or yes, no, however they decided to do it. Honestly,
and the
this is
extra
where Tara
comments,
starts to yell at
the
me.
extra feedback. No, the extra feedback on those, like, do you have any additional feedback, is always like, why isn't the coffee free
Mm-hmm.
and the room was too cold? And I'm like, okay, I have
Yes.
no control over
Yeah.
either of those things.
Right. And that's why I don't think they're worth all that much, to be honest. I get the idea, like you want to have snap reactions and all that kind of stuff. But as far as real implementable feedback, I don't think you get that from a level 1. We'll talk more about that in episode 2 when we go through some of the theories and all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of my controversial take, is they're almost worthless. So and again, this is where Tara starts to yell at me because I'm not a theory guy. But
it completely depends on how they're written. That is, if all you want is a perfunctory check the box, then that's one thing. If you want actual feedback, we'll talk about it later.
Okay.
Maybe I'll even like post a good example of a good survey for feedback. Maybe that will be a piece we give people for free.
Oh yeah, that would be a good one. I do think that's something that is harder to write than people think. I feel like a lot of people think they're writing, and I say this because I've done this. Like, I think I'm writing good evaluation questions, and then somebody that actually knows what they're doing comes behind me and goes, "Dude, that was terrible." I'm like, oh, okay, great.
And we're talking about course evaluation questions, not assessment questions within a module. That's a whole different topic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good distinction to make. So there's what we call the final knowledge check, or what most people call the test at the end of the course. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is you're already done, you passed the test, the course is over, and you get a survey link. A lot of times you'll get the same thing from like customer service, Amazon customer service, AT&T customer service. Whenever you have to deal with them, they'll send you a survey link. Essentially the same thing. We're just asking about training instead of, why your package got lost in the mail. But I do want to go back to one thing you said, because you were talking through Addy and how it's slightly different because we're a vendor. What I've started to realize, because this is in my work history, this is the first time I've actually been in kind of that outside vendor role. I've usually been internal in the company itself, and it is a different relationship, and what you're responsible for is a little different, because in the Addy process, I think we have the least amount of control and influence on the I and the E, those last two, the implementation and the evaluation, because, our job is to come through, we figure out what they need, we make the course, and then, we kind of give it to them. We do provide suggestions on, this is kind of how I think you should do it. You've told us kind of what you have. We've developed this course to be implemented in this way that we think makes the most of the resources that you have. But at that point, we don't know if that's actually how it's doing it or not. And then evaluation, we have almost zero of. We have, postmortems, which is what we call them, basically where we go through and look back on the project from an internal view and say, okay, what did we do well? What didn't we do well? And we kind of do that from an internal point of view. But as far as evaluation on the company and is this actually, meeting the need? And Tara, you may have more experience in this than I do, but I haven't seen a lot of that since I've been in this kind of third-party contract role, which makes sense because I'm not part of that company.
Yeah.
So I don't have, when I worked at internal, I could pull those reports. I could go into the HR system and I could pull who took it, what their score was on the test and how they're doing in role and all that kind of stuff. That was part of my job as that intermediary, is I would figure out if I had to do a lot of that evaluation work. So I would pull the reports, see who's passing, talk to their supervisors, see how they're doing, and kind of do that follow-up work on the back end. But unfortunately, we don't have access to all of that. So we can't do that even though it is, in my opinion, and my opinion may be shaped by the fact that I used to do that all the time. But so we just don't have access to the information we would need to do a solid evaluation from the client side. We can evaluate from our side, but not the client side. So I think that's the biggie for me. Is I used to be very heavily involved in that, implementation evaluation strategy, where now I'm kind of having to shift earlier in the ADDIE model. So,
and again, time and money. That's usually what it's about whenever you're a vendor like we are. People come in, they have a certain amount of money, they have a certain amount of time. They don't have time. The A and the E get cut off all the time. The I usually as well. We're usually not even involved in implementation. And soapbox moment for me, never cut off analysis and never cut off evaluation, because how are you supposed to know what you need? And how are you supposed to know if it was successful if you don't do those two things? And they don't have to take forever, but their evaluation and implementation are directly tied to analysis, as analysis is then tied to design and development. So it's a big circle, and they're all dependent upon one another. And if you cut two of the most important pieces off, basically the beginning and the end, you're just getting somebody who's basically taking your order. You're taking an order and building a course and passing it off, and you have no idea. And as an instructional developer, professionally, I don't want it for my ego. I don't want to know that it went well for my ego. I want to know if it went well for the students. Did they learn what they needed to learn? Are they able to do their job better? That was the point of it, right? So for me, that's what it's about. Yeah. And I am cut off from it all the time. It drives me crazy.
Well, I think you touched on something that, as far as like ID space, because we've been to the different conferences and webinars and all that kind of stuff, and that order taker kind of mentality is something that in the L&D world, it seems like we're always fighting back against that, because from a business point of view, they just want to come to you and say, hey, give me an e-learning on X subject in X amount of days, go. They don't want to hear us asking why. They don't want to hear us. And I get, this is a painting with a broad brush here, right? But in worst case scenario, that's what your learning and development team becomes, or order takers. And that's not using these folks to their best. That's not utilizing the skills that they hopefully have in the best way. So I do hear a lot about that kind of order taking mentality.
Yeah. And but we're in a different space too. Internal L&D, that's what you do. In a lot of cases. For us, our specific business model is more of a consultative type of, yes, we build courses, but we also try to approach it from more of a relationship standpoint. Like, tell us what's happening. That's the first question, is why are you seeking us out? What kind of issue are you having? And even determining if it's a training issue. I can tell you a million times that I've talked to somebody and I'm like, well, I'm not sure that's a training issue. How do you think training would solve that? And you talk them through and figure out, oh, you know what? A job aid would work for that. And while that sounds counterintuitive from a business approach, I look at it as a relationship building approach. I'm not going to take your money and go build a course that's going to waste your time and money. Why would I do that? And I don't want to waste your learners' time. Adult learners, as we will get into later, hate that. So why would we do that? So if a job aid will work, then let's build a job aid instead. So training is not always the answer to everything, but it's often where people jump to when there's a problem.
Sacrilege.
Sacrilege. I know.
We should have a 5-day training course for everything. Everybody in a classroom for an entire week to talk about everything.
Everything. 8 hours, everything. No breaks.
That's right. Who needs breaks? We eat lunch in the room.
Exactly. Exactly. No, all of those things are bad. Do not do any of those things. Those are all bad.
That's right. And anything you're writing, it's one space after a period. Remember that.
It's always one space after a period, Jeremy. And I don't have a learning theory for it. I'm just telling you.
I'm just saying different age groups have different amount of spaces after the period, okay?
Oh, I see. I see. Well, then why do you have 2 spaces and I have 1 is what I want to know.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? I don't know.
You skew way younger in the demographic.
Yeah, because that's what I was taught in my keyboarding class in 2002, 2001, 2002.
In 2001 and 2, that's embarrassing, is what that is.
Yeah, I mean, I graduated high school in 03. So yeah, it would have been like 2000, would have been 2002-ish. Yeah.
Well, let's not get into the state of the United States education system, okay? That's a whole different pod.
I had a great keyboarding teacher. Shout out to Mr. Gunner. He was fantastic. But anyway, so let's talk about the next episode. So, we've introduced ourselves. We've gone over a high level. Addie, we're starting to run out of time. So let's talk about our next episode. Our next episode is going to primarily be a Tara episode. She's going to walk us through a bunch of different learning theories. Addie, Kirkpatrick, a whole bunch of other ones that I don't know the name to that she'll educate us about on our next episode. She's going to go through all of those because these are what we use every day as we work. Even if you're in a situation like I am, even if you don't know that you're doing it, if you're making effective training courses, you're probably following one of these theories. And that's something that I've come to understand is that I make training that I would like because I'm a terrible student. So I figure if I can get through to me, it's a good training course. When I have that in mind, shockingly, a bunch of people a lot smarter than me have already figured out how to do this a long time ago, and I'm just kind of following their lead without knowing it. So Tara is going to walk us through all of that in our next episode. We're going to go over a bunch of different learning theories and ways to design and all that kind of stuff. Should be great. Tara, you want to throw anything on the end of that? Does that cover kind of what we're doing?
Well, I could talk about theories for hours. So I disciplined myself. I identified the 3 theories that you're going to need to be successful today as an instructional developer. You could leave the pod and go be an instructional developer with the 3 things that I'm going to show you. And I'm going to throw in, no, I'm not teasing what they are. I'll tell you what they are in the episode. But I'm also going to throw in 2 extras that you can use to up the smarts if you need it. So I narrowed it to 5. Okay. There are a lot more than that we'll talk about throughout the seasons or through the episodes. But I think that I wanted something you could take away and you could speak intelligently to things you're already doing or maybe about to be asked to do as a SME who may be called into a design project or development project. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks.
Awesome. There you go. Again, thanks everybody for tuning in. First inaugural podcast. Hopefully it wasn't terrible. And we'll see you next time. Appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.